Then you're on Zoom. Yeah, mine. Alice. Oh, yeah, okay. He is. I think so. Is it time? Yeah. Okay, good morning. This is one of the wonders, and I've been instructed to tell the Zoomers to stay muted and everyone to turn off their cell phones. Our speaker today is Jim Ragusa. He is a retired a professor of business and industrial engineering from the University of Central Florida. He has a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Illinois, an MS in R&D management, research and development management, and a PhD in business from Florida State. He served in the Air Force as a Titan II research and development officer at Vandenberg Air Force Base and in California, and then he's also a manager, scientist, and engineer at the NASA Kennedy Space Center. And he's going to tell us today about his experiences in the early part of the manned spaceflight program. So, Jim, thank you.
Okay, better? Can you hear? Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Jane and Pam, for inviting me to come out here today. This is a very nice facility. I'm going to talk my children into letting me come and live here. uh, you're fortunate people. So you see the title of my presentation today. And I need to sit because I have a problem with my back. But other than that, let me just give you my own quick introduction. I was born and raised in Chicago, went to the University of Illinois, got my mechanical engineering degree, and at the same time was commissioned as an Air Force officer. And I asked for an assignment in California to work on ICBMs as a research and development officer. And they laughed at the office. And several weeks later, they said, report into California. That's what you're going to do. So I spent 3 years doing that, from groundbreaking to turning over an ICBM system to Strategic Air Command. It was a silo-launched 100-foot, 5,500-mile range missile. And I did that and left the Air Force after 3 years and went to work for NASA at the Kennedy Space Center. And I worked there for 23 years. And when I retired from there, I had gotten my master's and doctorate through NASA sponsorship. So I went to work as a professor at the University of Central Florida, and I was tenured in the Graduate School of Business and Graduate School of Engineering. And I retired from university twice and went to work for the Army for 6.5 years as a consultant doing science management and artificial intelligence work and the design of an advanced armored vehicle. And other than that, I'm just a common guy. You see me on the street. I'm trying to finish my 7th book, which is what I do now in my retirement. So today I want to talk about some unpublished personal stories of the early space program. Most of you are of the age that you remember some of the systems that I'm going to talk to you about today, primarily Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And I'll talk just briefly about the shuttle program, which I worked, and also the International Space Station. And I was on the design team for the space station. And I want to talk briefly about the Hubble and Webb telescopes and a little bit about the future. I'm not going to talk about UFOs, captured aliens, or foreign spacecraft, because you do not have security clearance for that. So I won't say anything at all about that. I have brought with me some objects that you really ought to come up and look at. I have some signed autograph pictures, and I'll show you and tell you a little bit more about those. I have some tiles that have flown on a shuttle. You probably have never seen or held a tile. I have that. I have a piece of gold mylar that is like the mylar on the lunar landers, and pictures and some medals made from spacecraft, including medals made from Apollo 11 and the lunar excursion module, and Apollo 13, and some of those. That's part of my collection. So with that, let me start off by getting into the presentation, and let me get my clicker. If you remember, during the early days in the late 1950s, the Russians had a space program, and they were ahead of us. They put the first satellite into orbit. They put the first animal, and they put the first human into orbit, and we were trailing behind them in everything that we were doing. So in April of 1959, the United States selected 7 people out of a cast of hundreds to be the first American astronauts on Mercury. And I won't point out all their names, but I'll just mention who they are. Gus Grissom and Wally Schirra and John Glenn and Scott Carpenter and Deke Slayton and Gordon Cooper. I got to know all these people and trained 5 of them on Gemini, and I'll tell you more about that later. I didn't meet John Glenn till later, after he flew on shuttle on the 95th flight at age 77. And I don't know if you can see this, but John Glenn is here, upper right in this picture. The only one I didn't meet is Scott Carpenter. Here is on the lower level, second from the left. He went back into the Navy to do underseas research, so I never got a chance to meet him. So our first effort was to take a small spacecraft, one-person spacecraft, made by McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis. At the very top, that's the black thing at the tip of this rocket, and it has an escape system at the top and a rocket down below, basically one stage. That rocket, and there's a long story I could tell you, spend an hour on that rocket. It was developed by Werner von Braun in Germany. It's a V2 that caused havoc to England and France. We've made some changes to it. The Germans surrendered to the U.S. 300 German scientists, and all their rocket parts we could get a hold of in drawings were taken to White Sands, and this rocket was developed. I want to point out to you their escape system, which is down here at the bottom. It's a cherry picker, and if the astronaut had problems, you'd send someone out to the cherry picker to go up and get the astronaut out. So let me tell you about that first flight. It was and the astronauts, the 7, were called The Right Stuff on a book by Thomas Wolfe. All are deceased now, and I'm speaking for them. I'm in their place because I'm here and they're not. So now, Yuri Gagarin flew in 1961, in April of 61, and we launched this first attempt in successful flight in May, 1 month later. So we were again behind the Russians. It's an up and down flight. It's suborbital. That rocket is not enough to put that black spacecraft into orbit. So it goes up for 15 minutes and lands in the ocean. And it's picked up by a helicopter and put on a helicopter or on an aircraft carrier. And you probably have seen pictures of that happen. Now, let me tell you a little bit about some of the problems for the astronauts. It's a very small compartment. You can't imagine how small it is. You've seen some pictures of fighter planes. They're just jammed in there. And there's a hatch that's put over in this for this first flight with Alan Shepard. And there are 70 bolts that are put in. So can you imagine being put in a capsule like that with 70 bolts? There are 2 wrenches, one at the Space Center, Cape Canaveral at the time, and one on the aircraft carrier. How would you like to, anyone willing to do that? No one? You Jill chickens? Okay, so that's what happened. It was a successful flight. He went up, and the aircraft carrier was there for them for the recovery effort, and everything went well. The next flight, which was also suborbital, was by Gus Grissom in Liberty Bell. And Gus was one of the original 7. And I need to tell you something about this. The astronauts did not like the idea of being bolted in with 70 bolts. So McDonnell Aircraft put in addition to the bolts, a shaped charge around it so the astronaut could flip a switch, push a plunger, and the hatch would come off. So that's all really good news. So they felt better about that. But here's what happened in reality. The helicopter attached to the spacecraft after a successful flight, and the hatch blew open. And water started coming into the spacecraft, and Gus decided to get out, and he didn't have all the holes on his hose connections closed, and the deck dam around his neck, and he had rolls of mercury dimes in his overalls that people don't know about, and he thought he was going to drown. And I talked to him about that, and he said, I thought I was gone. And he was waving his arms in distress, and the helicopter thought everything was okay, and they didn't pick him up, but eventually they did, and he didn't drown, fortunately. The spacecraft sunk in 15,000 feet deep water, and we did not recover it until 1999. That's 3,000 feet deeper than the Titanic. So it was a real problem. So we lost that spacecraft for quite a while. Next, we needed to put something in orbit as the same spacecraft, the black, and on the very tip, you can see a red structure, which is the escape system. If they got into trouble, they could flip a switch and the spacecraft would be separated and they could come down and land safely. The vehicle was an Atlas V, and the good news is it was strong enough to put the spacecraft into orbit, but it blew up all the time. And when I was in California, we used to go watch the Atlas vehicles blow up. It was part of the regular routine. John Glenn flew on Friendship 7. He was really the father of the original 7. He was trying to keep them out of trouble. They caused a lot of problems in Cocoa Beach, partying, and I won't mention other things, but he was the sensible force with the crew. His first launch was in February of '62, and right after the flight, he was retired by NASA. And the reason for that is Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian in space, died in an aircraft training accident. And we did not want to risk losing our first astronaut. So he was retired, and as you know, he became a senator from Ohio. He flew again on the 95th shuttle flight at age 77, and that's a whole different story. The next thing that happened in our program was the Gemini flight. Again, we knew that people could survive in space, and this time we wanted to try 2 people. So at the very tip of this rocket is a black structure where the 2 astronauts sit. The white is a service module to give them oxygen, and we're going to go into orbit for extended periods of time. The vehicle was the Titan II that I had worked on in California. And what NASA did wisely is to contract basically with the Air Force to be the launch vehicle for the Gemini 2-person crew. And it's a very reliable rocket, and I could spend a lot of time talking to you about that. I knew every nut and bolt on that rocket, but when I left the Air Force, I wasn't assigned to the Titan II. I was assigned to the spacecraft, which I knew nothing about, so I had to learn about that. Now, this is important. McDonnell Aircraft was an aircraft manufacturer, and they knew about ejection seats. So rather than having that big tower that would pull the spacecraft off, they had ejection seats. They had a D-ring between their legs, and if they pulled it, you can see the doors on these high-tech things are hard for me to understand. Here's the door on one side and door on the other. When they pull that, I'm sorry. Oh, I got to point at the screen. What's wrong with me? There's a door over here on this side and door on this side. They're sitting on ejection seats, and they pull a D-ring between their legs, and they can eject even on the ground, which is 100 feet up. And I had to clean part of the palmettos out for their landing area at the Space Center. But it was a great program, great system, and we did well with that. One of the significant things, and I was talking to John Schmidt here earlier, who knew Ed White. He sat on Ed White's lap, right, John? Okay. Ed flew on the second mission, and Ed was from West Point. He was a military guy, highly disciplined, smart guy. I got to know him. I was in our meeting room when we got the call that his spacewalk was approved. And on this mission, he went out and he was tethered. They can't see it very well. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. He was tethered by this cord, which is about the size of a pencil, and this is his oxygen line. He had a little nitrogen bottle with jets, and that was his maneuvering system. So he went out of the spacecraft, and he was walking for the first American, and he was out for 36 minutes on this 25-foot long cable, traveling at 17,500 miles an hour around the Earth. How many of you would like to do that? Any hands? Oh, John would like to do it. A couple of you want to do it. Okay. Ooh, you're kind of crazy, aren't you? Anyway, here was the problem. Jim Divot, who was in the spacecraft, said, okay, Ed, time's up. 36 minutes up. We got this tight schedule to watch. Come back in. And Ed said, I'm having such, this is spectacular. You can't imagine the view I have up here of the Earth. And I'm seeing all kinds of interesting things. And he said, Ed, it's time for you to come back in. And, no, can I stay a little bit longer out here? Well, this was unacceptable to NASA, and he got commands from the ground that said, Ed, get back into that spacecraft. It's over for you. So we did. In my assignment there, I was only one of two NASA people assigned to the launch complex. And I should go back and tell you that as a result of being assigned like that, I was asked to show the astronauts around. It's kind of complicated at the top. It's hard to find where we had a slide wire system that would take you from the top to the bottom, and an elevator. And later on for Apollo, you'd get in an elevator and go down to a room, and you slide down a 100-foot Teflon line tube with a water spray on your back, and you go into a rubber room, and then you go into a dome, 30-foot dome with a bank vault door, and close it to survive. So I showed them around, and I started their required training for egress and rescue. So there was all kinds of things we had to do. And the other thing that happened is we had a system where you had to man-rate the escape systems to make sure that the astronauts did not die if they used them. They could break bones but not die. So I was the test subject to test all those things. So the last thing I did, I jumped from a 22-story tower and locked myself in with 5 other people in the underground blast room for 24 hours. And my wife read about an unsuccessful test, and she said to me one Saturday morning, I will never forget, do you get paid any extra for doing that? And I said, no. She said, do you know that we have 3 children? And I said, yes. And she said, do you know you're not going to do that anymore? And I said, yes, dear. So that ended it. So I just became the test conductor, and I didn't do anything daring. I was supposed to jump off a 32-story building structure, but I never made it. I'm disappointed about that. So Ed White came back, and he was disciplined a little bit. But the next significant thing, well, one of the tours I did a lot of tours, which is really interesting for me. I spent time with Norman Rockwell, the artist, and that's another long story. I met Walt Disney and told him a joke, and he laughed. And I met James Michener. I spent with him 2 days with him, and a whole bunch of other people. It was really a great, great experience for me. And one of the characters I met was Don Knotts, who's in the center here. And we were told that Disney was going to do a movie called The Reluctant Astronaut. And the story was that Don Knotts played the part of a janitor in Houston, and his family thought he was an astronaut, but he was really a janitor. And NASA decided they wanted someone to go in a spacecraft to show how simple it was. So he was the reluctant astronaut that went. That was the story. And I've never seen the movie, but I should. So he came up there with his production crew, and I told him a joke and made him laugh. Super guy. The crew said he wasn't acting. That's the way his personality is. He starred in 90 movies. And what happened is I sent the drawings of the White Room. That's the room that encloses the spacecraft to keep it out of the elements. And I sent it to Hollywood for their movie, and that was my contribution in addition to telling him a joke and making him laugh. The next significant thing was John Kennedy's speech at Rice University in September of 1962. This was after the John Glenn flight, and he challenged, as you remember, that we should, as a nation, land an astronaut on the moon and by the end of the decade and return them safely to Earth. Now, what happened after that, the story you may not know, is LBJ, the vice president, went to James Webb, who was a NASA administrator, and said, what can we do? We're falling behind the Russians. Can we perhaps build a space station, or can we orbit the moon? And James Webb said, it's easier for us to land on the moon. So that was the course of action we took. When I was a second lieutenant in the Air Force, one of my jobs there was to brief VIPs, and I briefed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man by the name of Maxwell Taylor, some of you may know, and I was asked to brief President Kennedy. And I was told I had 13 minutes, and I shined my shoes and got my uniform pressed, and I was practiced and ready to go. And at the last minute, he canceled out because his speech, his political campaign was not going well in Dallas, and he was going to go to Dallas. And he was going to come back after Dallas to hear my presentation of others. And when I was a professor, I used to tell my students, see, bad things can happen to you when you miss one of my lectures. That's kind of bad, isn't it? I'm sorry. That's the way I am. Anyway, so we decided to go ahead, and the method we did to do that was to rely on a former German Nazi and scientist from Peenemünde who came to the United States and eventually with 300 other Germans was made a citizen of the U.S. I had a chance to know this man. He's one of my heroes in spite of his earlier background. And let me tell you, we could not have gone to the moon without this man's mind. He's absolutely brilliant. He was funny. We used to tell stories, and I enjoyed being with him. So what happened is at the end of World War II, he knew that it was the end for the Germans, and there were two choices, one to surrender to the Russians or one to surrender to the Americans. And he said the Russians don't have any money, and the U.S. does. So he surrendered himself to a GI in a Jeep who had no idea who he was or what they were doing. But the word got out, and the U.S. went in and captured all the plans and all the parts we could without any fanfare. They were sent to White Sands, New Mexico, because they were Nazis, and the United States was opposed to that, but they were isolated there. And eventually they ended up in Huntsville, which was very much like their community in Germany. This is a very unusual picture. The next thing that happened was the Apollo series and a new spacecraft designed by Rockwell in Downey, California. This is a really unusual picture of the three astronauts for Apollo 1 praying. I've never seen another picture of astronauts praying. Gus Grissom is in the center, and Ed White is on the left, John. And Roger Chaffee, who had never flown before, was the new astronaut assigned to Apollo 1. Now, my boss sent me over to Apollo. There were two programs, Gemini program with about 100 people, Apollo program with thousands. And he sent me over and said, okay, you're the expert on egress and rescue. Go tell me about this spacecraft. And I looked and was briefed on the spacecraft, and I came back to him and the director of launch operations, and I said, we will never get those astronauts out of that capsule. It is too complicated. 3 hatches for the ground crew to remove and one 70-pound hatch for the astronaut. Laying on his back, had to reach over his head, lift this hatch up, and put it on the ground. I said, this isn't going to work. He basically said, son, and I was a young engineer, do you know how much it would cost to redesign the hatch? And do you know how much of an impact it would be on the schedule? We can't do that. So I left. What else could I do? I didn't have the horsepower to do anything else. I have with me today a very rare signed picture of this crew. This is the same session, but they're not praying this time, and it's signed by 3 astronauts. Gus hated the press because they had called him the wrong astronaut for blowing the hatch. He's very sensitive about that. We did everything we could to have him avoid the press. He did not want to sign autographs, but they signed this picture for me. It's really a very rare picture that I have. I have a copy here. I did not trust any of you to bring the real picture because I think some of you probably have a shady background, and I don't know. So anyway, I have that picture, which is in a bank vault and safety deposit box. Well, what happened next? You've all heard about the Apollo 1 fire, July 27th, 1967. I had trained them on the Tuesday before they died on the Friday. And they were in street clothes, and they got out of the spacecraft. And I found that they knew the spacecraft better than their living room at home. But once they got out, it was confusing. The white room and all that was confusing up there. So I walked them through everything in their street clothes. They practiced instead of going down from the top, we couldn't risk them. They could risk me, but not them. And we trained them at 25 feet off the ground, so they got a feel for the slide wire system. Well, that went well. And on Friday, same week, I was going to train them again, walk through with their suits on, the astronaut suits, because it's bulky and it complicates things. So we had the fire. I was in the blockhouse sitting across from the doctors, and I watched their instruments, the consoles, and I saw their heart rates go down to 0. We had a fire. It was on television, smoke. It was horrible. And I could tell you a lot more about that. But here's what happened to the spacecraft. It's a little confusing. Let me point to some things here. There are 3 couches. You lay on your back during the flight. That's the best thing. This is one couch. This is where your back is, and your legs are up here, and your feet are here. And then there's a 3rd couch over here. And there are struts here. You're on a platform so that when you land, you don't have such a shock. And these are the hoses for breathing and a mirror for seeing. Well, what happened is up to this point in time, we were using 100% oxygen in the spacecraft. And we had done this and it worked fine, no problem, whatever. Things were flammable. We had Velcro. We love Velcro. So it was all on the inside of the spacecraft. They put pencils up and procedures. Their suits were flammable. Everything was flammable in their paper. 100% oxygen. We think what happened is there was a spark created from a cable that people were walking on, including astronauts inside there, and it just caused a fire, and they died certainly within a minute. And I drove the doctors out to the launch pad, and so they could go up and see the condition of the astronauts, although they knew that they were dead. And I closed the pad so no one else could get up there and do anything. What happened next was significant. What happened is that 2 Rockwell engineers in a garage designed a new quick opening hatch, which is here. And you cranked the lever and it came open, and they could get out much easier. So this is what we did. It took 2 years between the fire and when we launched again. A lot of changes were made. 7 of us made changes to the launch pad and all. This is a spacecraft, Apollo, that has returned. Down at the bottom is the heat shield, and you can see some of the burning, and this is where the parachutes are, and the windows, and the hatch, and the handrails. If you're doing an EVA, you're going outside the spacecraft, you need a handrail to hang on to. So we had a new hatch, and we demonstrated, we had several early flights in orbit to make sure the spacecraft was okay. We had a lot of problems with this spacecraft, but eventually got it working. But we didn't have enough horsepower to go to the moon with an earlier, let's call it a baby Saturn, smaller Saturn. And we developed a 3-stage Saturn V, and at the very top is a silver part, which is important, with escape system on the top, and the Apollo module and a service module here. And the rest of it is 3 stages to get you into orbit first and then to go to the moon, to propel you to the moon. So we were all set to do that, and we, we, as you know, we're very successful with that. It's a very powerful rocket and very reliable. One of the early significant missions was Apollo 8, and this is the first time Americans or anyone had left the Earth and had seen another planet, another system, in this case, the moon. This is the famous Apollo 8 picture that was taken by one of the crew people. And the Apollo 8 people were not destined to land on the moon, but to go around the moon for the first time. And NASA said to them, say something good while you're doing that. And they orbited on Christmas Eve of 1968, and they read Genesis about the creation of the earth. And the greeting was, good night, good luck, Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. And this is the largest audience that had ever heard human voices from space. This is the saying by Jim Lovell, who, and have to watch my time here. Ooh, I'm really running late. Jim Lovell said this about it. I'll just go through this. Vastness of space, it's wonderful. Next was Apollo 11, and you know these pictures, Neil Armstrong on the left, Mike Collins in the center, and Buzz Aldrin on the right. This is one of 5 pictures that Neil said he'd sign before they left. They said they had time after they got back to sign more, but I got one of 5, and it says, thanks, Jim, for all your work over the years, and I cherish this one too. A quick thing about Buzz Aldrin, he's on his 4th wife now. He was married at age 93, and he's 95 now, so he's still alive, but Mike Collins and Neil Armstrong are deceased. Could tell you more about them. Let me just say this. Neil Armstrong was the ideal astronaut. He was the one that we all respected, and the astronauts respected. So as you know, he landed on the moon, and classic picture here. Let me give you one other story that is unpublished and you may not know. NASA had to decide who was going to be the first American to step foot on the moon. And it was a choice between Aldrin or Neil Armstrong. And I'll make this story short, but Neil Armstrong was a civilian astronaut, and Buzz Aldrin was military. So the White House denies this and NASA denies it, but who would you choose to be the first American, a civilian or a military person? So that's one of the reasons Neil was selected. That you see that gold foil in this picture, I have a sample of what that looks like. It's Mylar, and you can see what that looks like. The flags that we planted are all white now because of the ultraviolet fading of the flags. And let me go on here. I've got to really watch my time here. I don't want to say anything more about this. I think you're very familiar with it. Neil was, NASA said, say something good, and Neil said that once he'd landed, he thought of this, that this was a small step, but a great step for mankind. And I won't go any further on that. Apollo 13, let me pass through this. This is what was said. Greatest moment in history, not when man walked on the moon, but when God walked on the earth. The next big flight, oh, what did I just do, Pam? No. It's Apollo 13. You probably remember the great Tom Hanks movie, Apollo 13. Some of my friends were consultants for that, and they said, if you make this accurately, we'll consult for you, otherwise forget it. Let me point out something that is important that you may not realize. This is the service module. So you go to the moon with this rocket, and here's the propellant and oxygen in here, and the spacecraft is up here at the top. Well, what happened? Jim Lovell flipped the switch that caused this explosion in this oxygen tank. They lost all their oxygen, and they were in serious trouble. And it's a long story, and you can see the movie. But I'll tell you something that you just don't know. A friend of mine who joined NASA the same time I did, named Bob Seek, was the test engineer. And what happens with that oxygen tank, it's liquid oxygen, and you have a wire that goes through there. And when you need gaseous oxygen, you put current through the wire, and it turns the liquid to a gas, and you breathe the gas. Well, the insulation was off that wire. He didn't know about it. When Lovell flipped the switch, caused the spark to get into the oxygen, which blew out the side of the spacecraft. And there's a lot more to that story, as you can well imagine. NASA did not fire my friend, and he went on to be the successful launch director for 50 successful shuttle launches. Great test conductor and a friend. He couldn't talk to the astronauts for a while. They didn't want to face them because they knew what he had done. Here's the crew. There's one substitute. The man on the upper left, Jack Schweikert, was a substitute. He replaced someone who had been exposed to rubella. So that's not good to get lost in space under that. This picture you won't be able to understand, but it's very significant to me. This is my best award. The night before the Apollo launch, 4 of us got awards, and later on, our names were put on a piece of film. And see the upper left, there's a capsule much like the old Kodak capsules that you get the film roll out of. So the film was in there. It was placed on the moon in this location. Here's the astronaut's footprint showing the capsule, and a letter from the astronaut Jem Irwin and Wernher von Braun saying, thank you for your contribution. Now, there were thousands of people that made this possible, and not just the 4 of us. And when Congress found out about this, they said, you can't honor just 4 people when so many were involved, so stop doing that. But we don't have a way of getting back to retrieve it. So it's still there. Anyway, that's my best award. I got to keep moving here. Shuttle on the launch pad. I was up there. I used to go up there late at night. It's an absolutely magnificent structure and vision. The structure moves with the wind. The vehicle is creaking. It's really airy, but it's absolutely beautiful. This is Challenger on pad just before liftoff, and as you know, it blew up after 73 seconds. And let me just briefly tell you what the problem was. These are solid rocket boosters that are filled in Utah, and there are seams here. They're shipped in by boat in sections, and we put them together and bolted them, and there was an O-ring between the joints, about the size of your thumb, made out of rubber. You're familiar, some of the guys are familiar with O-rings. And it was a very cold night. We should not have launched. The schedule was being pushed. We launched, and what happened is one of the O-rings right here fractured, and the flame from the solid rocket went into the hydrogen tank like a blowtorch. And you've seen pictures of what happened with Challenger. So we lost all that crew. The explosion was in January of 86. They were twice the height of a commercial airliner when it blew. We think some of them survived till the hatch, the compartment hit the water. We lost Christy McAuliffe, one of the teachers on it, and a friend of mine who I'd met during earlier days, Ellison Onizuka, who was the first Hawaiian astronaut, and I even went to visit his grave at the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. Space station. No, let me tell you about Columbia. There are 5 orbiters. They were all different. Columbia was the orbiter I worked with. It was designed to house a space lab in the compartment. Let me tell you what happened with Columbia. What happened is, sorry, my big fingers don't work very well. This is insulation. Some of you are familiar with, you go to the ACE and you get a spray can and the foam foams up. Well, that's what we used here because the cryogenic tanks are like a minus 300, minus 400 degrees Fahrenheit in this tank, which is orange. And what happened with Columbia is a piece of insulation fell off, and hit the leading edge of the wing right here, was the size of a briefcase. And the shuttle under the tiles, and I have tiles here, the shuttle under tiles is like a commercial aircraft. It's just skin. It's just aluminum skin. And 5,000 degrees burned through. The crew did not know this. And I could tell you, spend an hour telling you about Columbia and all that. The bottom line is there's nothing we could have done to save that crew. When they came in, they didn't know. The vehicle broke up over Texas and Louisiana, and you know that story. Our next big venture was International Space Station. As I said, I was on the design team on an earlier version of this. This is absolutely a wonderful engineering marvel. All the pieces were never put together on Earth. They were fit together in the coldness of space. And it's been a very successful effort. First launched in 1998. It's due to be retired in 2030. And so we've had a lot of years up there, state-of-art science going on, and the first crew was there in the year 2000. You've recently heard about the 2 astronauts who were stranded up there, supposed to be up there for 8 days, Williams and, can't remember the other name, Wilcox. Let me tell you one thing, some things you don't know. It was a new spacecraft built by Boeing, and it had a lot of problems. The thrusters leaked. You need thrusters to position the spacecraft. You don't have a big engine. And they had helium leaks, and we use helium to pressurize the hydrogen or the cryogenic tanks. And the helium leaks and thruster problems, 5 out of 8 thrusters failed. We had solved those problems years ago. NASA did not have those problems, but that spacecraft did. The astronauts almost did not make it to rendezvous with the space station. You don't know that. They couldn't reposition, they couldn't get aligned with everything, but they finally did, and they survived. It was so cold in there, they had to get back in their spacesuits. So it wasn't a good thing. They were supposed to be up there for 8 days. They stayed up for 285 days. Didn't anticipate. A lot of problems. The astronaut's chin is pointed. You'll notice the female, her hair turned white. So a lot of problems with extended spaceflight. The next thing, I'm just going to talk briefly, Jane, and I'm basically through. Hubble Space Telescope, size of a Greyhound bus. You see the flap in the left-hand side, 9-foot telescope lens. You're above the light pollution of the Earth. It had to be repaired because Perk and Elmer just ground the lens, the solid lens, at the wrong angle, and we had to go up and put eyeglasses on it with the shuttle. It's very significant in terms of what it has discovered. It discovered basically the Big Bang, which occurred 13.8 billion years ago. And we know now that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Very significant in terms of what it did. It works primarily in the infrared, doesn't mean much to you, but for a scientist it does. The next big development was the James Webb Telescope, and I got to know him. I was moving chairs one day with him, with the NASA administrator, which is another story. Instead of being 9 foot in diameter, you want the lens to be as big as possible. This is 26 feet in diameter. It is located 1 million miles away from the Earth. It cannot be repaired. It's in a stable position there. The gold is the lens. The motors drove out the lens to form the individual elements to form the lens. The white is a shield to protect it from the heat of the sun and the Earth. The sensors in the telescope work at the temperature of space, which is minus several hundred degrees. Now, what's significant about this? It is 100 times better than the Hubble Space Telescope. And the reason for that is it works in a part of the infrared that can see through dust and clouds. So it sees further. So we're getting back. I'm getting there, Jane. Or Jane has got a watch time. This is typical of some of the pictures we're getting, and we know a lot more about the universe than we did. Let me tell you a couple of quick facts. We're in the solar system, the galaxy. It's a galaxy, and it's our Earth, it's the sun, it's the planets, it's the stars. It's estimated that there are more stars in our galaxy than are grains of sand on all the beaches of the Earth. Can you imagine that? So you look up and see the stars. If you were traveling at the speed of light, which is basically 1,000,000 miles per hour, it would take you 100 years to traverse our galaxy, traveling at the speed of light. You can't comprehend this. Let me give you another fact. With the telescopes, we now believe that there are 200 billion galaxies in the universe like ours. My little brain can't even comprehend that. 200 billion galaxies like ours in the universe and counting. So let me tell you, let me move on. My dissertation was on a space base. I do designs of organizations, and what I try to, if you have 50 to 100 people in this space base, it's a rotating wheel. How would you organize the people in this space base? 50 to 100 people in sometime in the future. The center part is zero gravity, zero gravity, and the outer part is rotating, so you have a gravity. And we have animals that we take up there, sheep, and you grow crops up there like soybeans and other things. And I was asked to write a movie for a Steven Spielberg movie on this. And I'm trying to get to that book, but I'm giving a presentation like this and I can't write today. So having to put it up. Anyway, this was my dissertation. And here was my problem. Dissertation committees, as some of you know, are kind of tough on you. They ask difficult questions. And they said, well, why don't you just organize it like Star Trek? You know, it's an old structure, like going back to Roman times. You have someone in top and functional areas and all that. And you have Spock, and you have the science officer, and Kirk as the captain, and Lieutenant Uhura, and all those people, Bones and all that. And they say, why don't you just do that? So I looked at that organization and about 17 others, and I had a committee do this evaluation. And I came up, and Star Trek came up 5th in the list. It wasn't the best. It wasn't the best structure, but I was afraid they were going to ask me about it. So I called Hollywood. I called Hollywood Burbank Studio and said, "Hello, my name is Jim Ragusa, and I'd like to talk to Gene Roddenberry, who did Star Trek." And they said there's a writer's strike. He's in New York City at the Ritz Hotel. So I called the Ritz Hotel. Said, "My name is Jim Ragusa. I work for NASA, and I'd like to talk to Gene Roddenberry." So there was a slight delay, and he picked up the phone and said, "Oh, this is Gene." So we became friends, and I invited him down to Cocoa Beach to be the keynote speaker at a Space Congress. So I worked with him a little bit, and Arthur C. Clarke, who did 2001. And I sent Gene a copy of my dissertation, and in return mail, I got this certificate. On the bottom is the Star Trek emblem with the gold emblem with the ribbons. And here's what it says. Jim Ragusa, hereby commissioned flight deck officer of the U.S. Spaceship Enterprise, the above named author having given proof of superior judgment and abilities, that's me, having, I'm sorry, it's kind of, having, anyway, be willing to take on challenges in dangerous situations, are ordered to report to the flight deck of the Star Trek Enterprise for duty. So I am a Trekkie, although I didn't know it before this. Anyway, that's also one of my favorite possessions, and I have a copy of it here. So this is my final slide, Jane, so you can relax. How did I do time-wise? I'm a little over, sorry. My final slide, let the force be with you, and you know what the force is. I like questions and answers. Do we have time for them?
Thank you. Very good. Questions? I told him there would be questions, so.
Jim, how long does it take for the image from the James Webb Telescope to be transmitted back to the Earth? You know that?
I don't know the exact number. It would be a matter of seconds, though. It's not hours or minutes. Yeah, it's fairly quick. Yeah.
What is being found out or achieved by flyovers over white sands?
I didn't quite understand it. About White Sands, New Mexico?
Okay, my daughter is a scientist,
Yes,
but she works on the ground,
yes.
and she was camping there. And then it was announced that everybody has to leave, but she didn't leave, and there was a flyover. But we don't know what the flyover was for.
If I understand the question, your daughter was a scientist, worked on the ground at White Sands. They asked her to leave because there was a flyover. Can you help me with that, Jane?
Yes, her daughter studies wildlife on the ground,
Okay.
and they were told to leave, and she's wondering, do you know why, what, and there was a flyover of what? Military flyover, so why?
You don't have a security clearance for me to answer that question. I have no idea. I was close to Area 51 at one time, but the military has moved to Utah for their testing now, and I don't know. I don't know. Any other questions? Any questions I can answer?
Thank you very much. And what do you think would be the best way to go forward? Building a space station or a space base or a colony on the moon?
Oh, boy, big question. If I understand the question, what would be the best way to move forward with either colony on the moon or space base? Let me give you a personal opinion on that. And I worked a little bit on lunar colonization and Mars colonization. You have to live underground. There's so much radiation, you can't exist really. I don't see much sense in going to the moon or Mars. There's nothing there either place. The moon, the only thing, we got a lot back from the moon. One of the interesting things is if you take lunar soil and mix it with Earth soil, plants grow better. Okay, and the important thing is the process of getting there and the technology that came out of that. And when I used to speak on spin-offs from the space program, the point I made is we have gotten more return from the medical developments that came out of the program than anything we brought back, the space rocks and all that. So there's nothing on Mars that's iron oxide. It's desolate. You might as well go to the desert. Elon Musk wants to send 100 people there and to colonize Mars. I don't see much sense in it. And I want to tell you one quick story. NASA went out early years ago and said, we need volunteers that make a one-way trip to Mars. We can't get you back, but we can get you there. We could perhaps bring your kids back. We had all kinds of crazy people who volunteered for that. And my wife put me on the list. But to answer your question, I don't know, you know. We've gotten a lot out of the space station that's going to come out. I think we get a lot out of the space base. Time will tell. I'm not a big Mars moon fan, actually. There's nothing in either place.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I'm just curious as to the astronauts that were up at the space station for 9 months when they were planning on 8 days. What did they eat?
Yeah, they weren't expecting this, so how could they have just added in two?
Well, they rationed everything they had there. No, they didn't. Thanks to, and let me make this point too. Aside from all the political intrigue, The person that's going to save us and the space program is Elon Musk with his SpaceX and his developments. Boeing has done a spacecraft which has not been successful. NASA has got a big program called Space Launch Facility, which is Space Launch System. Overpriced, way behind schedule. Musk is going to save the space program. To answer your question, what happened is Musk has 2 capsules. The launch vehicle, what he does is it's reusable. NASA didn't have that. So they've flown, the launch vehicle has flown like 360 times and they keep recycling it. That's the only way it's going to pay for itself. So what they did, Musk developed 2 capsules, one for crew and one for cargo, and they send a cargo module up on the SpaceX. And there's food in there, tapioca pudding and beer and wine and whatever they need, clothes. You have to bring everything back. You don't throw it overboard, the science experiments, the garbage, everything. And you take food and supplies up. And that's what happened. They were never out of food, living very well with it. But going up there has caused problems. Calcium leaks out of your bones, all kinds of problems. Her hair turned white in part, chin got long. It's not a good thing. And I have a person here, a friend who's a PhD in nuclear physics, and she's helping me with the radiation problem in space base. We don't know how to solve that. We can't take lead up there. Lead is the best insulator, but it's too heavy. Anything else?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And if you'd like, you're welcome to come up and take a look at all these various artifacts of this of his experiences. So thanks very much, Jim. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, when they have a launch that day.
Oh, really?
They never get out, they just stay there. That's the point.